Victor Hugo was right when he said there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Yes, the idea of freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Yes, that was the idea, but I declare that now is the time. And if America is going to have a chance at living out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then we cannot afford for this nation or its leaders to have selective ambition.
Welcome to the Policy Lowdown, the podcast from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, offering straight talk on the policies that matter most to Maryland communities. I'm your host, Kevin Slayton. One of the most important things we do together as a community is work to make sure that the next generation is set up for success. That includes things like supporting good public schools and high-quality childcare so that parents can work, but also addressing poverty and ensuring kids can get the health care they need. That is the focus of our conversation today. This is a big topic, so I'm glad we have two guests here today to look at the various issues facing children and families in Maryland and what we can do differently as a state to better set every child up for success. Today we have with us Laura Weeldreyer. She's the Executive Director for the Maryland Family Network, and my colleague at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, who heads up the Kids Count as their director, Nonso Umunna. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get too deep into policy discussions, I'd love it if you could share a little bit more about yourselves and your work. Let's start with you, Laura.
Okay, well, first, let me say thank you so much for inviting me on. I am admittedly a huge fan of MedCEP's work, and you've been a super valuable partner to Maryland Family Network, so delighted to be here with you. So I'm Laura Weeldreyer. I'm the Executive Director of Maryland Family Network. I have been in this role for a little over 3 years and have a long background working actually in K-12 school reform, both locally in the Baltimore City public school system and nationally. And this has been one of the most exciting and challenging roles of my professional career. Should I talk a little bit about MFN?
Yes.
Okay. So Maryland Family Network, or affectionately known as MFN, is a statewide nonprofit organization that works on early childhood. And what does that mean? We do two really important and complementary things, and it is a big part of what attracted me to this job. We support and oversee a tremendous amount of direct service, which means we interact with young children, parents, and their caregivers every single day through 3 statewide networks we run. And just very quickly, those statewide networks are Early Head Start that serves 0 to 3-year-olds, high-quality childcare, a statewide network of family support centers, which are 2-generation centers that serve both parents and children, and the Child Care Resource Center network, which basically supports childcare in terms of getting licensed, operations, being financially sustainable, and quality measures. So think about it a little bit like the central office of childcare, providing some support, coaching, mentoring, professional development. So all of that direct service is amazing, but the part that I love so much, and I assume what we're going to talk about today, is that we also do a tremendous amount of advocacy and policy work at the state level. So what I like to think of is that direct service gives us our street credibility. It informs us. It provides a feedback loop with our constituents about the priorities we should be addressing through policy and advocacy.
Outstanding. And Nonso, can you please share a bit more about Kids Count and what your role is in supporting this national project?
Thank you for having me, Kevin. So I'm the Kids Count Director at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. And the goal of Kids Count is to be able to look at household data and how to see how kids and families are faring. And in order to do that, what we do is we look at, Kids Count looks at state and national level data to see how families and children are faring in all the 50 states, including Maryland. So one of the things that we do in order to determine that is we look at 16 indicators across 4 focal areas. And that is economic security, education, health, and family and community. So if we're looking at, for instance, economic security, we're looking at things, for instance, as poverty rates, unemployment, and housing security. And if we're looking at health, if we're looking at education, for instance, we're looking at school enrollment, how the kids are doing, whether they are proficient, and also one of the issues we look at as well is whether the kids are in school, as well as early childhood, which Laura mentioned previously. Another area where we look at when we're looking at this is health, for instance, and such health indicators like low birth weights, for instance, and also things that enable children to be able to keep healthy, such as access to healthcare. That's one of the areas we look at as well. And when we look at, for instance, family and community, we look at the environment they're in, high poverty, and what that means in terms of some of the other issues that arise, like teen birth rates, high teen birth rates, and things like that. So that's what we look at when we look at kids count primarily.
Great. So there are a lot of different things we could dive deep into just based on those two introductions alone. But I want to start with the big picture. Laura, can you talk about the different ways the state supports children and families, particularly through the state budget?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, look, we're extremely privileged. Maryland is one of the wealthiest states in the country, and there is a lot to be proud of in this state, and there is still an awful lot of work to do. So let me talk a little bit about some of the various investments the state makes. Some of it comes with support from the federal government, but I'm going to focus on the state as you asked. First and foremost, and a big part of our work at MFN is around childcare, both access and affordability and quality. And I want to dwell on this for a few minutes because a program called Child Care Scholarship, and this is a program, some people will know it as Child Care Subsidy, or an even older term is vouchers. This is the program through which low-income families, or really even above low-income families by today's standards, but people with limited economic means can apply for support for childcare, and that includes before and after school care for school-age children, so not just 0 to 5-year-olds or kids before they're in school. This is our single biggest investment in childcare, so it's really, really significant. And it's a tiny fraction of what we invest in public schools. So it's pretty insignificant comparatively, but in terms of a policy lever at the state level, it's huge. So that's one way the state supports families by giving them, hopefully, a helping hand in accessing childcare, which, as you already mentioned, is necessary if parents are going to work or go to school or be in a training program, etc. Obviously, there is money for early childhood in the state education budget. We are, because of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, we are in a period of rapidly expanding pre-K for 4-year-olds, but now, as of this year, also for 3-year-olds for the first time in the state of Maryland. That pre-K is free for eligible families, which means up to 300% of the poverty limit, and then a sliding scale for families who fall between 300% and 600%, and then some sort of fee-based program for families above 600% of the poverty limit. So not only is there money for pre-K expansion in the Blueprint as part of the state's education funding, there is also money for a lot of early childhood programs, including the expansion of family support centers, which Maryland Family Network runs. We are opening 3 new family support centers per year for a decade. So in addition to pre-K expansion, the Blueprint also contains funds for some other really important programs that support families. One is the expansion of family support centers, which I mentioned earlier, that Maryland Family Network runs. We will be opening 3 new family support centers per year for a decade. There's also a huge expansion of Judy centers around the state, which also play in the early childhood space, connecting parents.
What are Judy centers?
They are centers attached to local elementary schools. So generally they fall under the auspices of local school systems, and they do a huge variety of things from connecting families to other public resources like Maryland Infants and Toddlers for early intervention. They sometimes provide programming for parents or childcare providers during the day, like a story time. They might have somebody who can help you fill out a WIC application. So they're kind of connection points. And because they're in schools, hopefully they are also connecting parents and communities to their neighborhood elementary school. So those centers are exploding around the state. And finally, the Blueprint also invests some much needed and long overdue funds in Maryland Infants and Toddlers, which is the early intervention program that will provide services to children at home, in childcare, or in their first years of school. That money goes to local school districts. Parents can call, providers can call and have their child evaluated for services. So really, really important long-term investments in the next generation. There are also many things the state does to support family economic security. So we have tax credits, we have WIC and SNAP. We try to make healthcare accessible for young children through the Children's Health Insurance Program. And then an issue that is very near and dear to MFN's heart is that last year during the 2022 session, Maryland became the 9th state in the country to pass paid family and medical leave. Now, this is an issue that affects way more than families with young children. However, that is Maryland Family Network's role in the Time to Care Coalition, right? Is this idea that when families give birth or adopt a child, families need time to bond. Families need time to heal. Families need time to take children to get their vaccinations and their well child visits. And no family in Maryland should be forced into the position of making a choice between the family who they love and the job that they depend on. So this is a brand new policy. It's really boundary pushing stuff because we think our policy is one of the strongest in the country. It is in the process of analysis and implementation, so it has not yet taken effect, but that will be coming. Many deadlines and monitoring of implementation to do between now and 2025. So obviously I just said a lot. I guess what I really want to say is that to really take care of young children, you have to take care of their parents. So babies and toddlers don't drive themselves to well child visits. They don't show up in pre-K on their own. You have to invest in the family. And there is a whole emerging field of science, brain science, about the role that toxic stress plays in families' lives, both in parental health, but also the health of their children, that there's actually evidence of toxic stress affecting DNA in unborn children. And also it's a highly predictive of child abuse and maltreatment. So this is really frontier, kind of next generation science stuff. And I am not an expert, but I think this has huge implications for the role of state governments, local governments, and the world of policy.
Thank you. That was a lot.
I know.
But
sorry.
Congratulations.
I'm passionate about the topic.
Congratulations on that hard-fought win in the legislature. It's a long time coming. Family leave will benefit so many folks in our state and our communities. But what we know across so many areas of the state budget is that just because the state is making a big commitment to something doesn't mean everything is going well. So Nonso, what can you share with us about what the data says about how children and families are actually doing in Maryland?
Yes. So like Laura was mentioning, I think we have to have whenever we're looking at children and families, it's a two-generational approach we should have. I mean, like she mentioned, if the parents are not faring well economically, it impacts the children. So if you're living in a household where your parents are having difficulty financially, it has an impact as well. It impacts the children and their ability, the parents' ability to provide for them, which in turn impacts their ability to be able to progress in life, whether it's giving them quality food, education, and things of the sort. So, like, I'll have to go back and say, like, the Kiss Count data center, when it ranks, Kiss Count data book, when it ranks the states, it ranks all 50 states. And Maryland is ranked 19th this year. Now, that's not a terrible number, but that's not where a wealthy state should be. I mean, we shouldn't be at 19th. We should be where New Hampshire is or where Massachusetts is. So let's take a look at some of what the data is showing. And what we find is that 153,000 kids, about 12% of kids in Maryland, are living in poverty, in households that are living below the poverty line. So that means that, they, like Laura was explaining, these are children that live in households that are economically stressed, and that has an impact on them as well. Another indicator that the data looks at is also the number of kids that live in a house where neither parent is fully employed or through the year or part-time employed, either way. And there are 315,000 kids in our state, about 23% of kids who live in Maryland who live in a household where neither parent has secure employment. That is very important and very critical to the child's well-being. Another number that it looks at as well is high housing costs burden, and it finds that about 414,000 kids, about 31% of kids in Maryland, live in a household where the parents have to spend about 30% of their income on housing cost alone. So, like Laura was mentioning, we don't want families to be in a position where they have to choose between putting a roof over their children's head and their heads and also providing for their children's needs. Another indicator is health insurance. About 49,000 kids in our state do not have access to health insurance. Now, this is one of the areas where we actually perform better. It's about 3% of kids in our state that do not have health insurance. But I always look at it this way: that's 49% too many. So we have to make sure that every kid has access to healthcare, because it's critical. If you do not have access to healthcare, that means that it impacts the child's ability to function. It's undermined in a way. So the Kids Count data book looks at, and maybe we'll come to this later, looks at mental health. It focuses on mental health. And it finds that about 1 in 8 children in Maryland say that they've experienced anxiety and depression. So in 2016, prior to the pandemic, that was about 105,000 kids in our state said they've experienced anxiety and depression. During the pandemic, 2020, that number had gone up to 143,000, about 38,000 more kids. Now, that was 9.4% in 2016. In 2020, that number had gone up to about 12.4%. And that's almost a 36% increase in the space of 4 years. And if we see what the pandemic has done in terms of kids' mental health and the support that these kids need, we see how important it is for them to have access to good quality healthcare so they can be able to meet their needs as well. Another thing is also, as I mentioned previously, 42,000 kids live in high poverty areas in our state, about 3% as well. Again, I will say that that's 42% too many. So that's mostly what the data shows. And like I mentioned previously, the data this year focuses, as its policy, the Case Count Data Book looked at mental health, specifically youth mental health, and the numbers that it finds nationally and also in Maryland in particular is very disturbing. And that's a critical area where we should focus on. And all the things we've mentioned here, economic issues, are contributing factors as well. If a kid is in a household where the parents are struggling economically, there's no doubt that it impacts the kid as well. So if we can be able to address those issues, we can be able to have a positive impact in these areas as well.
And you would think policymakers would be able to make that easy connection. No children is on an island. They actually...
Can I add one thing
Sure.
on this issue of mental health? I mean, here's one challenge when you're talking about babies and toddlers and kids who are not yet verbal and able to communicate about their own needs. Some of that data you just shared, very disturbing, is self-reported data. Nobody is getting babies and toddlers to fill out surveys about whether they're more depressed and anxious now than they were before the pandemic. And I don't mean to be flippant because it's a very serious topic. But My point is just those numbers are artificially depressed because they do not reflect children probably under the age of 5 and maybe even older. So to your point, policymakers in Annapolis did invest some new funds in infant and early childhood mental health last year. And that's great. It wasn't as much as we hoped, but it was a step towards that. So I guess I will just give you my editorial comment that for one of the wealthiest states in the country, 19th is unacceptable.
Any chance any of that revenue may come this session? Any chance to get more?
We're just in the season of people starting to figure out what's going to happen in session this year. And of course, we're facing statewide elections. And it looks like there's going to be quite a bit of turnover in the General Assembly and, of course, a new governor. So, no, I don't have any predictions about big new investments for this year, I'm afraid. Not yet.
Great.
We can talk again in January, December, maybe.
Now that we've outlined what the current situation is, I'd like to shift the conversation a bit on how we can do things differently as a state to ensure that all Maryland families and children can actually thrive. Laura, what do you see as the top priorities for the state, that those things that can make a big difference for children and families?
All right, so my answer to this is maybe not what you were envisioning because it's not a specific program or a specific need to answer. It is kind of a guiding principle, and that is the first 5 years are the most important. So by the age of 5, roughly 80% of a child's brain development has already happened. And so we're talking about for most kids before they get to school. Now we're expanding pre-K, so some caveats to that statement. But in a lot of states, they've focused on the first 1,000 days. So that's the first 3 years, with the assumption that there's some more programmatic interventions that start to happen around 3 or 4 years old. But many states have basically set out a first 1,000 days roadmap with resources, interventions, and various policies specifically aimed at making sure children's development is maximized and parents are fully supported during that first 1,000 days. So this is my answer because this point cannot be overstated. The return on investment for a state, for society, will be maximized by putting that money on the front end of children's life. There's actually Nobel award-winning economist research showing that this is, the layman's version of it, but the biggest bang for the social investment buck is 0 to 5 years old. So that's what I would really push policymakers on. Obviously, that is an oversimplified, statement, and it doesn't go into what does it mean, but it really means that we have to get rid of some of these old notions of public benefits as something that there shouldn't be universal safety nets for families in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in one of the wealthiest states in that country. We should be thinking of all of the resources and policies at our disposal, like expanding child tax credit, expanding child support scholarships, figuring out ways to keep kids on the WIC and SNAP rolls longer, all of the things that speak to some of the data that Nonso was just talking about that have to do with economic security of the family. And so, in short, invest in 0 to 5.
I agree. One of the changes that happened in our nation is once we saw that the benefit of public goods were extended to the other. It's a horrible indictment on our nation. We began to push back then and trying to determine who was worthy of those things that generations prior to had benefited and begin to put us on a track towards a much better future. Hopefully we can get back to that. Nonso, what would you add?
Okay, Laura was mentioning, I think making all these investments in families is very critical. One of the things we need to make sure is that we don't take any step backwards in the support that we're giving to families, especially by continuing to expand the end income tax credit in our state. We've seen that when people are giving cash in hand, it's a very, effective and powerful tool that, impacts all metrics. So I think we should continue to expand the child tax credit to reach more families. One of the things we saw last year on the federal level, was in the passage of the rescue plan with the child tax credit was the huge impact it had on child poverty all over the country, and in every state it was completely halved. And everybody saw that, and everybody was jubilant about it. We all, people were really thrilled that we've been able to do this in the space of a year by simply giving families the money to be able to spend on things that I was watching the News Hour at PBS a few days ago, and they were profiling families that have benefited from this, and the little things that the money was able to help them pay, and what it freed them from being able to help their children, provide for their children. So I find it baffling that this is going to be like a one-time experiment where we can look back and say that there was a time when we figured out child poverty and then we went back to the way things were before.
Do we know what will come of the research or the information? The mayor in Baltimore City is running a program to sort of get a sense with a couple families, and they're going to measure it over time. Will that influence in any kind of way?
You would think. I would hope. Now, one would have hoped that this experiment that we did last year and we saw the results would have spurred everyone to say, let's carry on. I mean, we have tax cuts that have been around for almost a decade. And then we tried this for working families, and everybody saw it was just a very clear, result. And yet, we're not having it this year.
That's scary, Nonso, because in essence you're saying if that wasn't enough to prove for us the necessity, how will this other program sort of...
I mean, I believe in miracles. The miracles can happen, but my only thing is that I just think that what happened last year and the results that we saw this year should have been something that everybody should have said, yeah, let's go for this, let's continue this. But apparently that hasn't been the case so far.
Okay, I'm dying to get in. So, I mean, you're raising such good and important points. There is a brand new report on child poverty from an organization called Child Trends. What has reduced childhood poverty is the expansion of these safety net programs. And that is, number one, a fact and undeniable. And number two, so worthy of expansion and replication. And if it can't be done at the federal level, then this is perfect fodder for state governments, or, as you mentioned, Mayor Scott in Baltimore City and the Guaranteed Income Pilot, which I am very excited about in terms of what the outcomes will be and what we will see. Also, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but we could do a lot of learning from other countries where the child tax credit is just standard operating procedure. It's just the way governments invest in the next generation and think of families as the building block of their society. So for us, it took a pandemic, because I think we have a lot of old ideas about things like the child tax credit being bound up with welfare and something that you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And anyway, I'll save it for a different podcast. But my point is, there's plenty of data from the National Academy of Sciences has really looked at how this money that families get in other countries. And by and large, this is not something that gets abused, that people use to stop working or to feed addiction habits, or I'm not sure what the conventional wisdom is about what ways that money might be abused. But by and large, it goes to do things like Nonso was saying, school uniforms, school lunches, camps during the summer so that kids are not sitting around with nothing to do, medical appointments. I mean, basic things that I think most Americans would agree are things we want for our kids.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you back, Laura, when we talk about Heather McGee's book, Draining the Pool.
Let's do it.
For the sum of us.
I'm in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything that Laura has said. I think we have to keep making these investments. And I didn't mean to say that hopefully what happens in Baltimore City gives a positive result and we can keep building on that, because if it can be done on the higher level, we will hope that it can be done on the local level as well and keep emulating that. Another thing that I mentioned before was also, I think, housing is another critical area. Like I mentioned before, families are spending all this money on housing alone. We know that the past few years that rent costs have gone up, housing costs have gone up, and we need to make investments in order to provide these families with give them the assistance they need. And we've, like Laura was saying, I mean, most of these problems that we're talking about here, we can't look at it and say, well, it was the pandemic. These were problems that were there prior to the pandemic. It's just that the pandemic just, exposed them and showed them to be. Just for instance, when I was looking at, and I'm just diverging a little bit, but I was looking at the NAEP numbers that came out for education yesterday.
NAEP, can you explain to our listeners what NAEP stands for?
It's the National
National Assessment for Educational Progress.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's the one where they only tested 4th and 8th graders, right?
Yes, 4th and 8th graders. So I was looking at those numbers. I've been looking at it for a period of time. And when I looked at the numbers and I saw that the numbers had gone down, and it's big national news, I thought about it and I just thought, but those numbers were not really good prior to the pandemic. It wasn't like, we were still having kids about 60-something% who weren't proficient and things like that. So it's not that the pandemic it's just that things were bad. The pandemic just made things worse. So that's where we have to look at things from. And I think we need to try and find ways to be able to provide families with assistance. And it's been done on the federal level. But the problem is just that this has been short-term. It's not. We need long-term solutions here for families. One last thing I would say is that, like Laura mentioned, there have been lots of good legislation that's been passed, like Blueprint, paid sick leave, all of this. They're very good. The important thing now is to make sure that those bills that are passed are fully funded, are fully implemented, fully funded, and that the most important thing is to make sure that they achieve the goal that they were meant to achieve. And we have to keep evaluating that they do that.
Again, thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom and insights. We're going to close out, as we always do, with what we call today's action items, things you can do today to help build a stronger Maryland. So Nonso, what would you recommend for any listeners who are interested in supporting efforts to increase economic security for Maryland families?
One of the issues I talked about was protecting and expanding Maryland's working family tax credits. And if you're interested in learning more about this effort and supporting the campaign, you can go to taxcreditsformdfamilies.org. Again, it's taxcreditsformdfamilies.org.
Thank you. And Laura, close us out. What is your action item?
I have a short list, all easy, quick things that you can do if you want to follow these issues or support them in some way. First of all, every week we have pieces about early childhood and young families on WEAA called First 5 Years. They're also posted on our website. On our website, you can sign up for our public policy alerts, which will let you know what's happening in Annapolis, who to write, who to call, what hearings to show up to. They'll keep you very up to date. We are just about to release a statewide parent survey about childcare in Maryland. So please, if I could ask your listeners to do one thing, fill out the survey, share it with your network, post it on social media. You can, of course, follow Maryland Family Network on social media and find out about all of these things, including the fact that in mid-November, we're going to be hosting some small group parent workshops to get deeper perspective on priorities and needs for Maryland's families, including their ideas about how we would know that Maryland families are thriving. So all of those are easy things that you could do that would help the work and the cause tremendously, and we would love to have you.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. You can find podcast archives and references from this episode at mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. That's mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email list. You can find the Maryland Center on Economic Policy at MD Economy on Twitter and Instagram, and MD Economy Policy on Facebook. See you next time.
Those that would stand up, call our nation back toward justice and righteousness are often bashed or labeled as socialist and unpatriotic. Many are labeled as instigators and rebel wild.